Look at all this beautiful honey. We'll be with you in a few shakes. We're just getting some of the other channels rolling, so stay tuned in. We'll be here to answer questions for about an hour. If you've got questions, you can put it in those comments below. All right, we're rolling on all channels now. Thanks for your patience. Honey month here in Australia, and we're appreciating the amazing creatures that the honeybees are and just the extraordinary amount of honey they can produce. There's no other, I guess, insect on the planet that can do this for us in terms of pollinate. A single hive like this might be able to pollinate 50 million flowers in a day. And while they're at it and they're doing well, they often store more than they need, and we can share some too. So we're here in the Southern Hemisphere. It's honey month here in Australia, and it's this time of year that people are doing a lot of harvesting with batch processing. Now, as a flow hive beekeeper, it's more common to harvest as you see the honey is filling in the frames. So for us as flow hive beekeepers, there's many months that are honey month, and we're harvesting as we go. But it's a great time of year to appreciate and celebrate what the bees are up to. Now what we might do is harvest a little honey and answer your questions. So if you've got questions, put it in the comments below. We're here to answer away. All I'm doing now is putting on these little shelf brackets. Then some people often miss this, but it's this cover that turns into your harvesting shelf, just like that. And then we've got a range of different options in terms of our jars. We could harvest little jars like this or into big jars like that. These are a really nice thing to do if you've got a wedding or something like that. We've taken hives to weddings before and harvested right from the hive for all the guests, and it's a super sweet thing to do. Excuse the pun, but it's hard to help. I mean, bees are so beautiful. Okay, if you've got questions, put it in the comments below. I'm just having a look, and this hive doesn't actually have a whole lot of honey, so we'll just harvest one frame today, and the frame I'm going to harvest is the one right on the edge here that I can see has honey capped in the window. It's ideal to harvest the honey when the bees have put their capping all over the top. It's like the lid on a preserving jar to say that that honey is ripe and ready, meaning the moisture content is down below that 20% range, and the honey will then keep forever for the bees almost, and forever for us, provided the moisture content doesn't get too high. So you want a good lid. Now we're going to be just putting this little tube in. If you've got questions, put it in the comments. We're here to answer any questions, beekeeping, flow hives, and we're taking out this little cap here. All I'm doing is inserting this key. It's easier to do it in a few segments. Sometimes it can be a bit tricky to turn the actual key, depending on how the bees have actually glued together the frame parts. Because if you think about what we're doing is we're separating wax and propolis to form the zigzagging channels. My father and I's invention we call the flow frame. Okay. So all the way in now, and I'm expecting it to go slow this morning because it's been a cold night here, and this is the edge frame, so typically it will be a bit cold and flow a bit slower, but that's fine. We can just answer questions as the honey is coming out. Any questions coming in, Trace? She's going to be reading them out.
Yeah, so I've got a question coming in from Anna wondering, do you need to plant flowers for the bees nearby?
You know, you don't need to plant flowers because the bees forage on an enormous radius. Typically, they'll fly out of the hive, beat their wings at 240 cycles a second, and fly far, usually within a 3-kilometre, 2-mile radius, and then bring all of that nectar back into the hive. But if they're hungry, they'll go 6 miles, 10 kilometres away, bring all that nectar back and dewater it and produce honey. So it's an incredible amount of work, and for that reason, you don't actually need to plant flowers, but it's fun to, because it attracts a whole lot of species to your garden. It will do a little bit for your bees, but obviously you need to plant a lot, considering these Apis mellifera bees can visit 50 million flowers in a day. So it's hard to plant that many in a small little garden, but if you've got acreage, by all means go and plant out acreage of flowers for your bees, which is a wonderful thing to do, where you can even choose the species. You might decide you want medicinal honey, and you might be planting medicinal species and so on. In fact, I'm seeing some medicinal honey here. If you watch closely, you'll see a property that's called thixotropic, because I can see that the little jelly-like globules coming out every now and then in the honey stream. Sometimes you get a lot of that, sometimes you don't, but that's our local Manuka species, Leptospermum polygalifolia, which is a thixotropic and highly medicinal Manuka honey.
Great seeds. Joseph's wondering how much honey could you get from a 7-frame flow hive?
Okay, so if the frames are full, you'll be expecting something like 3 kilograms of honey per frame, which is about 7 of these jars full. So 7 sevens are 49, so you're getting almost 50 jars of honey if you harvested them all. Now in springtime that can get pretty exciting, because a couple of weeks they can fill it up again. But equally, other times of year, you might be waiting a long time, and sometimes you need to exercise a lot of patience, especially if your colony's a bit slow off the mark for whatever reason. They're not building up in numbers enough to really forage and collect a lot of honey for you. So sometimes you need to be patient, like any kind of farming. Look at that jelly globules coming out. That was amazing. Very cool. But average here in this location, not moving our hives and chasing the honey flow like commercial apiarists do, then we'll be expecting to harvest all of these frames a couple of times a year on average. So you get a couple of buckets full of honey from a single hive. Commercial apiarists will chase the flowers by moving their hives to the flowers, and in that way they can really maximize their honey yield. Now I better swap that, because the honey is really starting to flow. Look at that, beautiful. Yum. Oh, it's got a slight licorice flavour. I'm not sure where that's coming from. One of the joys of flow hive beekeeping, and it's not something we set out to achieve, it just happened kind of by accident, is harvesting single frame honeys really lets you appreciate much more flavours than a conventional hive. Because have a look at this, and perhaps you want to come around and let the light shine through these jars, and you see this one's almost black. It's a really dark red. Then you've got these really light tones. Typically we get these tones in the springtime, we get the darker ones through winter, and you get this checkerboarding effect where if you harvested that frame now, whatever's flowering at the moment will be coming in and filling that frame again. And that way you get all of these different colours and flavours from your frames in a single hive. So it's a wonderful thing, and often really brings about amazing conversation when you present all of these different colours and flavours on the table, because conventionally people are often thinking, oh, honey's just honey, but there are so many different flavours, and this really highlights it, harvesting single frames to jars. And some clever beekeepers are marketing that and managing to not only harvest honey in an easier way, but getting a higher price for their honey, because it's taken on a reputation from a flow hive to have more floral notes and more flavour retention, because there's zero processing. The honey hasn't been spun through the air, it hasn't been in contact with a big metal centrifuge, it hasn't been mixed with a whole lot of different types of honeys, and it's just simply flowed out with gravity and zero processing, and for that reason we've even had university studies to say we're getting a higher flavour retention than conventional centrifuge harvesting.
Right, Seeds, we've got Gil in the USA, and just the question is, what do you think, and I think what they're saying is, what do you think if you've got 2 brood boxes with a honey super in the middle to get your honey production up, given there's a short honey flow in the US, and then Gil's come back and said separated by 2 queen excluders on the top and bottom of the honey super. I think they're thinking you'll understand it.
Yeah, that's fun to play around with, a multi-queen hive. So what they're suggesting is a brood box here with the laying queen, an excluder, your honey collection box, so that would be your flow frames there, then another queen excluder, then another brood box on top, and you can certainly do that. Whoops, that's just in time. And it is not uncommon for people to play around with that in the commercial landscape to try and maximise honey yields per hive. And it also has the backup plan of, if you lose one queen, the other can keep the hive going. So instead of getting that issue where your hive dies out if the queen dies, you've got the other queen maintaining the colony. However, it can be a bit fiddly to get going, so be prepared for it to perhaps not work the first time, but by all means play around and see if you can get yourself a multi-queen hive going. The reason you have the 2 queen excluders is to make sure, and separated by a box here, is to make sure the colony's pheromones aren't really close together and the queens can't get to each other. So that will really increase the chances of the 2 queens surviving. Oops.
You've got honey going everywhere. You're going to start landing on you soon, Seeds.
Yum.
I say, Brenda's wondering, when you twist the flow key, the handle, does it crush any of the bees?
So we put a lot of attention into that over a decade-long prototyping phase with my father. And what we ended up doing, because we did have, if you imagine flow frame cells like this, we did have parts in the beginning when we were doing our initial first experiments with this concept. We had parts meeting each other, and while that worked fine for the harvesting, if the bee was in the cell, that it might be a harvesting process going on. But imagine if you then pull the frames back together, then these 2 parts that are touching each other could So to save the bees' name, what we did is we created a gap, patent about that, that the bees have to fill in. So rather than having parts like that, we have a gap there that the bees have to wax, and then the bridge is closed when you open, and when it closes again, you've got bees to, if there is bees down the cells. Now, it's a good idea to be harvesting when there isn't bees down the cells, but you can't always guarantee there's not a small portion of the comb that has no honey in it, and there might be bees down there. So for that reason, we have that V-shaped gap, allowing the bees to then get out. At first, you've got a situation where the wax there might still catch a bee a little bit as the parts move, but because you've got a whole helping hive, the worker bees can then chew away at that wax and free that bee. And I can confidently say harvesting in this method would definitely harm a lot less bees than conventional methods of harvesting, because I used to do that for years. Just bear with us and think of your questions, put them in the comments below. We're just changing a microphone here to make sure you can hear Trace, who's reading out those questions. Here's a piece of honeycomb, which is another beautiful thing you can of course get from a hive, any type of hive. Bees will create honeycomb if given space to do so. So in the brood nest, you'll often find honeycomb on the edges of the hive. You can pull out the cap in the inner cover and let them build honeycomb in the roof cavity, or you can put a whole nother box on here for the purposes of collecting honeycomb. Some people like to put an ideal, which is like a shallow honey super that's just for honeycomb purposes. And that's a beautiful thing to experience too. Okay, we've got a few bees interested in the honey because the bees are a bit hungry at the moment. So no surprises. If you look at what's going on in the windows, you can see that the bees are a little bit hungry. So what we might do is just, there's one bee that's in there. I'll show you how to fish that out. It doesn't really cause a problem for the bee. They can be in honey for a long time, and all you need to do is fish that out, stick it back on the landing board, and the bees will clean her up quick smart. I'll show you that now. I'll see if I can get her right on the landing board just here. How about I do it there? You can see in the light. So she's licking up the little honey drops straight away. And soon enough you'll see some other bees coming to help, and she will be just fine. Okay, if you find you're getting a lot of bees coming for the honey, it's a really good idea to cover up your harvest. Now, it's a little bit harder when you're swapping jars, but when you're swapping jars, little jars, then you're right there anyway to make sure no bees are really getting in the honey. But if you're doing a larger jar, then a piece of wax wrap or kitchen wrap is ideal, just for putting over the top to make sure you're not getting a jar full of bees.
Right, so Tina's wondering, with the new Flow super lifter, can it be used on the front or the back?
Yes, absolutely. We tried to design it as versatile as possible, being used on flow hives, Langstroth hives, just conventional boxes that is, and you can open it in either direction, which is super useful, especially if you've got the scenario where you've got a fence or something in the way and you really need to open it in one direction or the other. There's another nice full jar, beautiful. It's a lovely colour, isn't it? It's got this beautiful golden, slightly red tones. It's always fascinating to hold it up to the light and really have a look at the honey. So the super lifter, I think last week we gave you a demonstration of that on this hive actually. So you can certainly open it in either direction just by putting these load point screws on the side you want to open. So here they are here. So this is all set up to open either way.
Jacob's wondering, Seda, do you have to have a brood box?
Yes, you do need an area for the bees to raise their young. So if you just go and put flow frames, that's not the correct sizing of cell for bees to raise their young in. So you'll need to have at least one brood box below your honey super. Now, you can have it in a configuration like this hive here, where you've got a single brood box and a single super, or in this case there's a double brood box and a single super, or you can have a single brood box and multiple supers. Now, it will depend a little bit on your seasonality. If you've got a really punchy season where there's not much flowering most of the year, but everything flowers at once because there's a long snowy winter where nothing much flowers, and then all the species have to do their flowering in a few months. In those kind of places, like perhaps in Canada, you'll likely be running more boxes because the bees expand so quickly with so much forage that you might have one or two brood boxes and maybe multiple supers just to house the booming colony you get in those few months of extreme nectar flow. So seasonality, where you are in the world, will affect the configuration. Get some local knowledge. As a flow hive beekeeper, we do have some more options, and simply because we can harvest directly out of the hive without having to take the boxes off. That allows us to continually harvest throughout the year as we see the bees are doing well and filling up more frames. And that means instead of storing honey in boxes on the hive by stacking big 12 stacks of boxes, we can just harvest honey and store the honey in jars on the shelf instead. So it's a slightly different mentality, but the advantages are you don't need that whole shed dedicated to sticky honey boxes ready to go back on the hive. You can run a more simple configuration which has the whole extracting room built into this Flow Hive Super.
See, Scott's tuning in from southwest Victoria on the coast. Scott recently lost their queen as he'd noticed there was no eggs or larvae, but there were queen cups in the middle and the bottom of the frame. So his question is, should I just let the nature run its course and let the bees, create their own queen? Or should he get a queen from a breeder? His worry is that if he waits for a breeder, or waiting for the queen to hatch actually, that's going to be a long, slow process, and he risks losing his hive. So I'm just wondering what's the best way to get it sorted for him.
Well done, firstly, for noticing. Now, you've obviously noticed the drop in numbers and got into the hive and noticed there's no young larvae in the cells, showing you that there is no queen at the moment. So if there isn't any eggs down the cells, your hive won't be able to raise another queen. They need an egg to do that from, because that larvae, the worker bee larvae, every single one could be a queen if the bees feed it royal jelly for its entire 11 days of larvae phase. So if there is no young larvae or eggs in the hive, then the bees won't be able to raise another queen. So your options then become putting in some resources from another hive. Let's say you had another hive and you could pull out a frame that had eggs on it. You could transfer it in and give them another go at raising a queen. Now in your case, it looks like you might have spotted it quite early, and you want to be sure they haven't already raised another queen. So perhaps look at it over the next week and have a look and see if any eggs appear down the cells. And if they appear at the bottom of the cell, then it's likely you have a queen laying. If they appear on the side walls of the cell, that could be a sign that you've got laying workers. Now, laying workers can't fertilise the eggs, which means they will be male drones. So it's important to pay close attention as to how the egg's looking down the cells. Whether it's a single egg in the bottom is a good sign that those eggs are laid by a queen and likely fertilised and will be good worker bees, and away the hive goes. So keep a little eye on it. If there's no laying queen, transfer resources from another hive with eggs on it, or if you can, as you were saying, buy in a queen, then you get known genetics, and that can be really helpful. You could be after genetics that are nice and productive, or perhaps Varroa's bad in your area and you're after genetics that tend to do a good job of keeping Varroa numbers low. Perhaps you're after some nice gentle genetics because your hive is in close proximity to people, and ordering a queen from a breeder is how you can get a really nice, gentle, productive hive. So if you can, do that. If you can't, transfer a frame from another hive that's got eggs on it.
Great. Anna's wondering, Sita, do you need to take the wax out of the flow frames to clean it, or do the bees just take care of it and repurpose it themselves?
That's the amazing thing. Come and have a look at this side here. This is the frame we are actually harvesting right now. And give us the heads up, give us a thumbs up if you can see bees chewing away at the wax in this region. So what they're doing is already starting to chew away at the wax because they've noticed that the honey's drained out from beneath their feet. It's a bit of a wild card in the beginning. We didn't know whether they would do that, and we had all of these contraptions to uncap the honey frames in the hive because that's what we were used to doing as conventional beekeepers. Now, it turns out the bees are clever enough to know when the honey's drained out from beneath their feet, and they will chew away at the capping, reuse the wax and recycle it. To answer your question is yes, you can watch them reuse and recycle that wax in that area, and it's a wonderful thing because it saves them producing a whole lot more wax.
Great. Cedar Martin's tuning in from sunny Brisvegas up the road, and he's just wondering, he's a new beekeeper and started harvesting in February, has had 45 kilos since February, but he does seem to get some honey leaking into the bottom tray, and he's just wondering what causes that. He said his recent harvest though, he only inserted the key about 3 centimetres at a time and took it very slowly and have reduced the leaking a lot, but still getting some. I'm wondering if we get much leaking when we do our harvest.
The answer is sometimes. So depending on how the bees cap the frames. So imagine you've got a whole frame surface like this one, and let's say they had a higher viscosity down low. So the honey was thicker down low, and that means the honey at the top is trying to flow down that channel we've created and hitting a roadblock, and that's when you can get it coming out the side. So that's one reason, but it's another reason is you can get obstructions to the honey flow path from wax buildup, and that can happen for a number of reasons. Perhaps you've used the frames for a long time, perhaps they're not closing back to fully closed now and they're sitting up just slightly. So that'd be a good thing to look out for. If they're out of line like that, what happens is in this region, to create a good enough cell shape, they'll put a big blob of wax. And you can imagine what happens when you open it. Now you've got half of this opening obstructed. And if that's happening down low in the frame, then you're restricting the flow and you could get honey coming out the side. Now, you can't always control how the bees cap the honey and what they do, and how much wax they put in there, how much propolis and so on. So it's not uncommon to get spillage of honey inside the hive when you're harvesting. Now, to me, that hasn't bothered me too much because as a conventional beekeeper, every lid I'd lift off, I'd be ripping the piles of honeycomb, there'd be honey flowing down through the hive and out the entrance sometimes. And the bees are quick to really clean all of that up. So the bees are good at cleaning up honey spills. However, if you're getting absurd amounts of honey that are overflowing the tray in the bottom and so on, then something's wrong. You'll need to go through some troubleshooting, get in contact, make sure that the levels are right with the slope of the hive and so on, and monitor it. Now back to the issue that can create some problem where the cells are out of line like that. The tip we now recommend is when you close off the frame is to make sure you leave that key pushing those cell parts back down for a minute or two. That way all of those parts will be forced back down. You can imagine if you just do a quick close, the parts can sort of spring back up with the resistance of the wax and propolis that's building up in every cell. So that's a good thing to do as a practice, is turn the key, leave it for a minute or two to really push those cells back into cell form position. Now, if the cells aren't really closing properly, but you want to fix that, then harvest the honey if you can. Take the frame out of the hive, put a key or two in the top to push those parts down, and really warm up that frame by putting it in a black tub in the sun or a black plastic bag in the sun, and you'll notice that they'll all just sit down as soon as that temperature really warms the wax. Sometimes you can get away with it in the hive, where if you notice the section's out of line and not seating back down, you can just put a key in the top and leave it there for a few days and the parts will go back. But more commonly, you have to remove a frame to fix that issue. But as said, a little bit's normal. A lot of spills overflowing the tray at the bottom isn't. So get in contact if you're having those issues, and let us know how you go next time, and also fantastic on the honey you've been harvesting. That's really good to hear. You've been getting some great honey. Let us know what it tastes like.
Seda, Nicholas is wondering, I'm not quite sure, how's the disease authorities where you are? I guess the DPI perhaps?
So in New South Wales, here where we are, in Australia, the governing body is the DPI. So it's important to register as a beekeeper with the DPI here, or your governing body of your state, so that you can be informed about issues that might be taking place that are affecting bees. And there's a small contribution to make to help manage the honeybee industry as well. So that's an important thing to do, is make sure you register. They'll be sending you information, useful information about bees and any kind of issues that might need action in your area.
Right. Mrs. Yeah Baby, his question is, when is the best time to start a flow hive, and do you need much experience?
So about half of our beekeepers are brand new to beekeeping, and that's fantastic because our invention has inspired a whole new wave of beekeepers who don't want to dedicate a whole room in their house or their whole shed to an extracting facility. And doing it this way has captured the imagination of many and inspired many to take up beekeeping. So for that reason, we produce an incredible amount of content. We're here to answer questions each week as well. We've got a dedicated online course at thebeekeeper.org as well. If you're really someone who wants to go through a step-by-step training course, then have a look at thebeekeeper.org. It's free to try, and also an amazing fundraiser for our pollinators. Now, back to your question, the answer is yes. Flow hives are definitely suitable for beginners, and half of our customers are beginners, and many of them become very good beekeepers because we have a lot of information, a lot of learning material. We're here dedicating time every week to answer your questions, and there's also more features on a flow hive that allow you to look into the windows and get an idea of what's going on in your hive, and a bit of a heads up whether you might need to do some inspections and so on.
Apples is wondering, Seda, how often do you need to inspect the hive?
So the answer really depends. Now, we've just probably moved out of the golden era here in New South Wales, where there's a long history of bees doing really well even when they haven't had a lot of care. Now, even though as a responsible beekeeper, you need to be getting into your hive, going through each frame and checking for pests and disease well, conventionally here, commercial beekeepers would do that at least a couple of times a year. Get in, go through every brood frame and check for pests and disease. And also, they would look for any issues and be inspecting hives as needed, and also doing spring management where they're making sure the hive is the right size for the hive to thrive in spring but not swarm, and that's the balance they're often riding. So springtime is a time of year you'll be inspecting a bit, and if you have a Varroa issue in your area, that has increased the time that we need to spend in the brood nest at the moment. So we're now recommending each month here in New South Wales, as we're in the build-up phase of Varroa, and making sure we're monitoring for those mites. So that's more inspections than we used to need to do. So get some local knowledge, also chime in, let us know how often you inspect your colonies where you are.
Cedar, Jen's asking, what do you do when your hive gets honeybound and are not building out comb hardly at all, but have lots of honey stored in the honeycomb?
Okay, so honeybound means you've got a lot of honey, as you say, in the frames down here in the brood box, and there's also honey up here. So there's this issue where the queen's looking for empty cells to lay eggs, the bees are looking for empty cells to clean out to prepare for the queen to lay, but the hive's full of honey. There's so much honey. So that can create issues, especially in springtime, triggering the hive to swarm because there's nowhere for the queen to lay. So in the springtime, it's common for beekeepers to check for that and to harvest honey to make space. Now, if you harvest honey in the top box, out of the honey soup at the top box here, the bees will usually move honey upwards, alleviating some congestion down below. But if you've left it quite late to do that, and your hive's already preparing to swarm, it'd be a good idea to get down into the brood box and take some of the honey away from the edge of the hive. You can cut up pieces of honeycomb and put those frames back towards the center. The bees can then create their amazing wax matrix we call honeycomb, and that's fresh real estate for that queen to lay a lot of eggs in, and that will relieve that primary swarming trigger. So it's great you're thinking about these things. In springtime, get in there, make sure your hive's not honeybound, harvest some honey, harvest some honeycomb, and make sure there's enough space for your queen to lay, and that will lessen the likelihood of your hive swarming and losing half your bees.
Great. Cedar, does the colour determine the sweetness of the honey?
No. The sweetness is the ratios of different types of sugars in the honey, which is determined by the flowers that are producing the nectar. The bees go and collect that nectar, and they bring it all back to your hive and start dewatering it. Even when they come home, they're already starting that dewatering process by taking some of the water out on their bodies and even dribbling some nectar down their tongue, letting it evaporate on the wing. And they come back and they pass the honey or that nectar to a receiver bee. So they bring it up out of their special honey stomach, not their digestive tract. They regurgitate that droplet of nectar, and you might get one or even two receiver bees licking up that nectar. And it's this cool moment where if you happen to witness it, there's this beautiful ball of nectar that's being passed from one bee to another. And then that other bee will go and take more water out of it in its body, then splash it around the cell walls. When you've got a good honey flow on, you'll see the droplets of nectar all around the cells in the back here. And the bees will be fanning away, dewatering it further. So it's an incredible amount of effort the bees go to really to produce honey and really get the water content down. And the sweetness, to get back to your question, simply comes from the nectar source. And you can get honeys that are bitter depending on the nectar source. You can get honeys that are ridiculously sweet and you'll get honeys that taste like a lolly shop. You get honeys that taste sort of more burnt caramel malty, like the Melaleuca in the paperbark down in the valley here. Or you'll get the light, more just a typical honey tasting honey in the springtime from the macadamias down here. Then you'll get the really light, blow your taste buds off from the wild quince flowering here, and even the privet, really aromatic, very light honey. And the sweetness, however, can be there whether it's dark or light honey.
Fantastic. Thomas is wondering, Cedar, with the super lifter, could it work on a hive when all your boxes are mediums?
Yes. So if all your boxes are medium, you'll have to pay attention to the lifter points. Now, We have done some demonstrations here showing you how to configure your screws. If you dial back in some of our live streams, we've showed you how to configure your screws if you have a medium in the middle or if you have a medium on top. But what we haven't shown you, to answer your question, is if they're all mediums. But what you'll need to do is make sure this spacing is correct. So you'll need to make sure you're clipping the boxes together like this, and the point at where you want to separate to get to the brood nest, you'll just need to make sure the spacing is that far apart. So if you're opening this bottom hive, then this screw will be pretty low down if they're all mediums, and high up on the next medium to get that spacing. But as long as you've got that spacing, which is about 245 millimeters, and there's a bit of leeway on the lifter, then you'll be good to go opening, rolling those honey boxes over to get to the brood box below.
Cedar, can other insects enter the hive?
Yes, we're lucky we don't have the yellow jackets here, which are a predatory wasp that get into hives in Europe and also in America, and they can be very annoying. They can fly in the entrance and start really decimating bee numbers. So if you have issues with that, I mean, bees will do their best to keep anything out of the hive. If ants try and go in this hive, these bees will keep them out. But one thing they can't keep out is those predatory wasps. If you're in North America or you're in Europe and you're in a zone where there's lots of those wasps, you may need to reduce the size of your entrance. We have an entrance reducer, or you can put anything in the entrance to block it up a little bit, give the bees a better chance to defend the hive against those wasps. Also a good idea to go and destroy any colonies of those yellow jackets you can find locally. And if you've got any issues in your area of other insects that might go into hives, chime in, but they're the only ones that I know of, really.
And what about, Cedar, the best way to keep wax moths away?
So keeping wax moth away is, first of all, okay, we've got another jar of honey, we better swap there. Thanks to the bees for their amazing effort producing honey. It's an incredible thing and something really to celebrate here in Honey Month in Australia. It's beautiful. So wax moth are a pain, particularly in conventional beekeeping. Reason why is they love destroying wax comb. Now, the time that they destroy it isn't when it's in the hive. The bees will keep the wax moth from entering the hive. If you've got a healthy functioning colony, wax moth won't be a problem in the hive. Now, some parts of the world you might find there are issues when the bees are bunkering down into a small ball and the numbers are low, and wax moth might be able to do some damage. But here, and in most places, wax moth won't get actually inside a functioning hive unless the colony's already dying out for another reason. But where they are a pain is conventional beekeepers are typically taking frames off, cutting the wax capping off, spinning the honey out in a centrifuge and putting those boxes aside. And now when they might be waiting to go back onto another hive, and they might be there for months or an entire season, the wax moth are a real pain then, because they will destroy the comb, leaving all this webby stuff behind. They'll even start eating into the wooden frames and destroy frames as well. Whereas here, as a flow hive beekeeper, wax moth cannot damage flow frames. So there isn't an issue there, and our frames generally stay in hives. So they don't tend to bother flow hive beekeepers so much. Where you might see them though is in the tray below. The tray down here, it's typical for a whole lot of wax to fall through just accidentally as the bees are working. Wax moth can use that to live on and breed in the tray. Simple fix is clean out your tray from time to time and you won't get wax moth building up in the tray below.
Right. Cedar, April's wondering, how do you know when it's okay to harvest? Is it once the honey's filled the end window, or should you take out each flow frame and look to make sure it is actually all capped?
Okay, you can certainly pull frames and have a look at it, but we have designed this system so that you can get a good idea of when to harvest by looking in the windows, taking away that point of needing to inspect the frames. Now, here we don't have a honey flow at the moment, so what we're seeing is a lot of honey that's been eaten away. Now perhaps there's a good example of that here. You can have a look here. Now after a while you get your eye in of what's going on in these windows and how that might represent what's going on throughout the hive. If you have a look here, we have got the wax cappings on top. Now, it's typical when they're building the cappings to be spreading out like that, and there's a particular look as they close the cappings. But when you've got this issue, well, not an issue, but when you see that it's completely full, then there's random cells that have been decapped and emptied. That's when you know they're actually retracting their honey stores. We've had a lot of wet weather here, and even though we've had dribs and drabs of honey flows coming in, the bees are hungry at the moment and they are decapping and using some of the stores in the honey super. So that's not actually a good time to harvest. And while we're only harvesting one frame today, we're going to leave the rest for the bees and wait till there's a bit more activity of honey coming in. When I see that these cells that are empty are being filled back up again and capped, we go, aha, there's a honey flow on. That means they're likely to be filling the center frames too. And then this rear view is great because you can see that we've already harvested these frames and they are empty, so we're not going to be harvesting those. This one you can see was full, but they are checkerboarding it. And when you see full, full, empty, full, full, empty, empty, that's the sign that the bees are hungry and actually chewing away the capping and taking the honey stores for their own use. Now, the filling pattern is very different. The filling pattern looks like a whole lot of cells at the same level-ish, all filling out together. So once you get your eye in with what it looks like, you can then start to gauge what's going on in the season and know whether it's a good time to harvest or not, and also get a good idea of whether the frame is likely to be capped throughout.
Cedar, Ainsley's wondering, they have a flow hive and they've been, I'm not sure how long or where they are, have tried to keep bees in it, but the bees just always seem to move out. Just wondering what maybe they could be doing to keep the bees into their hive.
Okay, that's an unusual scenario.
Yeah.
Generally bees will stay around. So what you're talking about there is absconding, and I can't be sure why your bees are absconding because we get very little of that. The time that I have seen bees abscond is when the hive beetles have taken over a weak colony and it's all going to rack and ruin. The remaining bees take off to create a new home without that hive beetle slime out really taking over the frames. So I'm not 100% sure. We probably need a bit more information to help you there in terms of what might be going on in your hive to have your bees not stay around. Getting a little help from a local beekeeper might be a good idea as well. But basically, if you're starting your hive, the bottom box, it's just basically like any other conventional Langstroth hive at that point, and it's a good idea to not add any more boxes until they are fully using all the frames in the box below. So you don't want to create unnecessary space, especially in those cooler climates. It makes it harder for the bees to keep it warm. But even so, adding another box too early doesn't usually cause absconding. Bees really don't like to leave their active brood, and they usually will be staying around. So we'll probably need a bit more information about what's left behind in the hive to understand why the bees might be absconding.
Right, Simon's tuning in from the Backyard Beekeepers in southwest Victoria, and Simon's wondering, when we have to use treatments for Varroa mite, is it going to affect the honey?
The answer is yes, actually. So there are some treatments that you're not allowed to have the honey box on. Now, that does differ from country to country. Some of those treatments are allowed in Australia to have your honey box in, but not allowed in other countries. So check your local regulations. So what I'm talking about there is the synthetics. Some of the synthetics miticides that are built to control Varroa mite, you're not allowed to have your honey collection area on the hive when the treatment's in. Now that's a challenging scenario for us, because we can keep bees in this climate with the honey supers on all year round. So get an informed choice as to which treatment you are going to use, and make sure you're following the regulations as to, if they say you can't use a honey super, then you will be taking the honey supers off and treating the brood. There are some that you can use the honey super on, and there are also the non-synthetics like formic acid, thymol or oxalic acid, which can be used with the honey super on. Now, formic acid is that smell you smell when you squash ants. It's found in honey already and many fruits and vegetables. Oxalic acid is found in a lot of our vegetables as well. So those ones are allowed, and yes, you will get higher levels of that in your honey if you're using those treatments with the honey super on. But because they're deemed natural chemicals that are in our food anyway, they are allowed to be on. So it's a bit of a minefield when you are researching which treatment you want to use. There's a good tool put out by the DPI, there's links to it on our website, which helps you make that decision-making process. There's also ones set up for other countries as well, and you can go through a little choice, what's your seasonality like, where are your bees up to, do you want to use synthetics or do you want to use the non-synthetics, and it'll help you with that decision making and tell you what's available in your country.
So George is wondering, when you're harvesting from the flow hive, do the bees realise that you're extracting the honey and then decide to eat all the honey?
Well, sometimes, like today, they are a bit hungry, and if a bee comes around and realises that we're harvesting honey out the back, it may go back around to the entrance, do a dance in the hive, and let a whole lot of bees, and it'll probably be a round dance, and somehow they can really give accurate information. They'll say, hey, this great honey source just around the back, and you'll get a jar filling up with bees. So for that reason, you always want something at the ready to cover up your jar to make sure you don't end up with a jar full of bees. And if you're harvesting to a big tall jars, that makes that process easy, because you can just put this over the top of your jar. So if you've got a jar like this, and make sure it's pressed around so no bees can get in, then you can walk away and come back when your jar is nice and full.
Right. Cedar, someone's tuning in, beekeepers tuning in, saying the bees have filled the brood box with mostly honeycomb and not much brood in the middle. Just wondering what they should do. So they're putting lots of honey in, but their queen's obviously not laying much brood.
Okay, so a good laying pattern is when you have a lot of brood area centrally in your hive. So you do want to see at some point, hopefully soon in your case, large areas of worker brood. Depending on the season, of course. If you're in the time of year where they're throttling down, perhaps you've got a long cold winter and that's you're heading into, then they will throttle down their hive. The queen will lay less and it'll all look a bit patchy. But provided you're in a time of year when the bees should be booming, if you're not seeing much brood and your hive's honeybound, then first of all make some more space in there by taking some of the honey out from the edges. You can enjoy cutting out some honeycomb, take it to your next gathering. It'll create great conversations for the table. Put those frames back in towards the centre of the box, give some new area for the queen to lay. And if you're still laying very patchy and the hive numbers are starting to dwindle when other hives are booming, then you may have a queen that's just really not performing anymore, and it could be a good idea to swap her out for a queen that has virile genetics in the first few years of her life and is able to lay thousands of eggs a day.
Cedar, Nat's wondering, are you able to extract bee venom when using a flow hive?
Oh, no, we have not designed any bee venom extracting devices. Now, bee venom is used in medicine sometimes. There's a product called Beetox, which basically is like stinging your wrinkles with bee venom just a little bit, and because it has a swelling effect, then it would puff out those wrinkles. Seems ridiculous, but I think it was called Beetox. So bee venom is not something we've ever thought about collecting, but I guess there are weird and wonderful ways to collect bee venom if that's what you're trying to get.
Cedar, if you don't harvest the honey, what happens? Do the bees just eat it, or?
Yes, so the bees are they're squirreling away lots of carbohydrates in the form of honey for when they might need it later. So for that reason, especially if you're in a place that gets a really long cold winter with many months where the bees can't forage, you do need to leave enough honey for the bees to survive. Now, they might need a whole box of honey to survive the winter in your area. They might need just half a box of honey and a little bit in the brood box. Or they might need even more in extreme cases. So the bees are storing it for themselves. When they have it in abundance and they've got more than they need, that's when we can share some too. And it's pretty incredible, I think, to have insects. Each little bee might only harvest a quarter of a teaspoon in its whole short life of perhaps 2 weeks foraging. And the sheer numbers of bees means that you can get a real amount of produce. They're an extraordinary species that are able to visit thousands of flowers a day each. And if you do the maths, a hive like this could visit 50 million flowers in a day. So we really owe it to the bees. We're Honey Month here in Australia for not only their beautiful honey, but their pollination services that they provide when they're visiting that many flowers. And they're completely intertwined with our food system now. And things really start falling apart in terms of the food crops we can produce if we lose this species, Apis mellifera.
Cedar, you've been mentioning Honey Month here. Listeners tuning in saying, what does that actually mean for us in terms of, should we be setting up our hives? What should we be doing? Eating honey?
Should be appreciating honey. Now, Honey Month here in Australia has been called just because this time of year, in conventional beekeeping, it's when people are often taking off their boxes, taking their frames to an extracting room and spinning out the honey. So there's honey in abundance to harvest and refine and enjoy. For us as flow hive beekeepers, we tend to have Honey Month throughout the year because you can now harvest as soon as you see a single frame ready and the bees are building up their stores. You can get in there and harvest honey just by turning the handle, and that makes it this different experience, I guess, of harvesting honey throughout the year rather than storing boxes of honey on hives for batch processing at the end of the season. The Honey Month is here to celebrate honey. You'll find people entering honey in shows, winning prizes and so on. It's a wonderful thing to do, and I love honey, so it's great there is a Honey Month. and just that focus on not only appreciating honey, but these incredible species that really is an important part of our agricultural food system. Now, we shouldn't let bees eat honey outside the hive, because that sends them into this robbing mentality of looking for honey instead of flowers. And that's why I was brushing that bee away. Don't leave honeycomb sitting on the hive like this, or open jars. You don't want to walk away, because what you'll find is one bee will lick a bit of honey, go back and do a dance inside the hive and tell all of its colleagues where the honey is to get. Then that hive will get in a mood of robbing honey, and it'll tend to go and find weak colonies and rob all the honey out of them. So for that reason, you're always taking honeycomb away, keeping it indoors, not leaving it out for the bees to find.
Nice. Cedar, I'm not sure what this question is, but it's like, why do people say you don't get beeswax? I'm thinking from flow hives, or...
So beeswax is often a byproduct of conventional harvesting, because you're cutting the wax capping off and there's a whole lot of wax there. So imagine you're cutting this wax capping off every time you need to harvest. And you could then collect that, melt it down, make some candles. You're also melting down old frames and so on. In a flow hive, the wax tends to stay in there in the flow hive super, so you're not getting a byproduct of wax from harvesting in this way, which means the bees don't have to create that extra wax, and it takes about 7 kilograms of honey to produce a kilogram of wax. So there's an efficiency gain there. However, if you do want to collect wax, you can from any type of beehive, a flow hive or conventional hive, by taking some of the frames out from below here. If you're using naturally drawn comb like we often do here, then you can even just cut out a square like that out of one of the edge frames and put that frame back in. The bees will be quick to repair that comb, or you can take the whole frame away and replace it, or you can cut out the whole frame of honey and put that empty frame back towards the center. It's a good way to cycle out the frames, keep them fresh in the bottom box. You can also collect honey under the roof here by taking the honeycomb in the roof, by taking the little plug out of the inner cover, allowing them up into this roof cavity. If they're on a strong flow, they'll start to build comb up in the roof here as well. You might like to quarantine them to a smaller area though, because otherwise when you lift the roof off, you've got this honeycomb structure that's going to break and be a bit messy. Fun for a while, but in the end it's actually nicer to use, say, a glass baking dish over the top so that you can easily get the roof off and enjoy watching them build honeycomb in a smaller area. Or if you want to collect honeycomb to perhaps sell or share, then you might like to add another box dedicated to honeycomb collection. Either another deep box this size or a medium is often common for collecting honeycomb. You can put that above this box, you can put it below this box, and the bees will produce a whole lot of natural honeycomb there as well. Got time for a couple more questions?
Oh, great. Cedar, I'm just wondering, a question coming in saying, do we supply instructions when customers receive their flow hive on how to install the bees into the hive?
Yes, absolutely. We have countless videos of every weird and wonderful way to put your bees in the hive. So I'll go through the main methods, but if you do want a really in-depth training course, have a look at the beekeeper.org. It's made to take you from square one right through to even a deep scientific knowledge in beekeeping. It's got experts from all around the world putting amazing content there in the form of video training, and you can sign up to that one. It's free to try, and also an amazing fundraiser for the bees. Or have a look on our channels. We've got countless videos showing you how to catch a swarm and install it into your brood box. Or to take a split is one of the common ways to get started in beekeeping, which is basically taking some of the frames out that have eggs on them, putting them into your hive. You can let them raise another queen, or you can buy in a queen from a queen breeder. or perhaps the easiest way to get going in beekeeping is ordering what's called a nucleus or nuke, or in some countries they call it nuck. And what that is a going little mini hive in a box that's half of one of these boxes in size. And it'll have 4 or 5 frames, it'll have comb like this on the edges, it'll have pollen stores in the form of bee bread, it'll have brood and a laying queen. And all you've got to do is situate it where you want in your yard after picking it up from the breeder, and choose a nice warm sunny day like this, get in your bee suit and your smoker, and you're transferring them into your brood box and look after them, and they'll grow from there. And there's also a bait hive, which is putting your hive out and hoping some bees will move into it. You'll need to increase your chances of, there's a bait hive up in the tree there, by putting it 6 to 12 feet off the ground and putting it near other hives in the springtime. And you might even like to put some lemongrass oil in there, in a little Ziploc bag with a few pinholes in it to have a slow release lemongrass scent, which is said to mimic some pheromones that will attract a swarm of bees. It's a bit hit and miss, but you can get bees to move right into a hive sometimes.
Great.
Thanks for all of your great questions. Time for one more.
Yeah, great. Look, this is a sweet one to end on. John's wondering, do you think the bees can see the sun on a cloudy day?
That is a fascinating topic that keys right into the bees' navigation. So the bees, in all the books you read, they use the sun as a navigational point. Now, they will choose an angle from the sun that they are flying, and then communicate that to the other bees in the hive by doing a dance on the honeycomb surface. So if this is the honeycomb surface, and the dance is a figure of 8 leaning over, the axis of the figure of 8 compared to that axis to vertical is the angle that the bees need to fly compared to the sun to get to the flowers. Now, it's pretty amazing to think about decoding that for a start, but also how do the bees actually use that? Now, to me, there's a lot more to it than that, because that's very rough information. The bees also waggle their tail. It's called the waggle dance, and that helps tell the distance. They percuss on the comb surface as they waggle as well, which in the dark and amongst 50,000 bees, you imagine they can't really see that bee dancing, but they can feel it dancing. But there's a lot of communication going on in the hive in all sorts of ways, but they're able to accurately tell the other bees where to go and exactly which window to fly in my case, to get the honey mess I've made experimenting with flow frames. So they can be incredibly accurate conveyors of language, and we've still got a lot to learn. But another thing that's been discovered is they do have a chemical in the body that responds to the Earth's magnetic field. So they have an internal compass, if you like. And that's another guiding mechanism to perhaps answer your question. Is even on a cloudy day, they have a few tricks up their sleeve. They will look at landmarks, they will use their internal compass, and they can also see in a different spectrum to our eyes. So perhaps when you can't see the sun, they still can. It's quite incredible, really, and one of the really fascinating things about the organisational structure of Apis mellifera and their huge colony and their amazing language. Thanks very much for tuning in and helping us celebrate and appreciate Honey Month here. We'll certainly be appreciating honey here today. I'm going to be making some beautiful honey chocolates, and we will be enjoying them later on. Chime in, let us know what you like to do with honey. Share your recipes. Send us your photos of your honey. Describe what it tastes like and where it's coming from. See if you can work out where it's coming from, which is an endless fun game. And yeah, just a big appreciation to the bees for their amazing pollination and their incredible honey. Thanks for tuning in. Same time next week. See you then.